The grease trap beneath the industrial sink had been leaking for 3 days, and Margot Duchamp was running out of towels to soak up the mess. She crouched in the narrow kitchen of Le Jardin, the upscale French restaurant in Chicago's Gold Coast, wringing out another sodden rag into a bucket that should have been emptied an hour ago. Her white uniform blouse clung to her back, damp with sweat and dishwater, and a strand of dark hair had escaped her bun to stick against her cheek. Table 12 needs their check. Marco called from the expo line, not bothering to look at her as he plated another duck confit with hands that moved with practiced precision. And someone needs to tell Genevieve that her section is backing up. Margot pushed herself upright, ignoring the protest in her knees. 23 years old, and her body already ached like someone twice her age. 4 double shifts this week, and it was only Thursday. She grabbed the check presenter from the printer, smoothed her apron, and pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room. The contrast always struck her. Back there, chaos and heat and the constant pressure of orders backing up. Out here, soft lighting and murmured conversations, the gentle clink of crystal and the rustle of expensive fabric. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 2 worlds separated by a pair of doors and a universe of circumstance. Table 12 left a decent tip, at least. 15% on a $200 bill. Margot folded the bills carefully, tucking them into her apron pocket where they joined the modest collection from the evening. Rent was due in 6 days. Her sister Colette's insulin prescription needed refilling in 4. The math lived in the back of her mind constantly, a running tally of what she had versus what she needed, and the gap between them that never seemed to close. Margot, Laurent, the floor manager, appeared at her elbow with his tablet and his perpetually disapproving expression. Large party just called. 8 people, arriving in 20 minutes. I'm giving them to you. Her stomach dropped. Large parties were unpredictable. They could tip generously or stiff you completely, and there was no way to know until the damage was done. But she nodded, pulling out her order pad. Which table? The private room. Laurent's expression softened slightly. VIP guests. Pierre wants everything perfect tonight. The private dining room at Le Jardin was reserved for the restaurant's most important clients. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Michigan Avenue, and the table could seat 12 comfortably. Margot had only worked that room twice before, and both times had been nerve-wracking experiences that left her hands shaking from the pressure. She spent the next 15 minutes setting up, ensuring every wine glass gleamed, every fork aligned perfectly. The room had to be flawless. Pierre Beaumont, the restaurant's owner and head chef, was particular about his VIP service, and he had no patience for servers who couldn't meet his exacting standards. The party arrived exactly on time. Margot heard them before she saw them, male voices echoing from the lobby, speaking rapid English punctuated by laughter that held an edge she couldn't quite identify. Laurent appeared in the doorway, his face carefully neutral, and gestured for her to follow. "Be very careful with this table," he murmured as they walked. "And whatever you do, don't react to anything you see or hear." The warning sent ice down her spine, but Margot kept her expression pleasant as she entered the private room. 8 men in expensive suits were settling into their chairs, radiating the kind of casual confidence that came from never being told no. Their watches caught the light, gold and platinum, worth more than Margot would make in 5 years. The man at the head of the table commanded attention without trying. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. When he glanced at Margot, she felt assessed and dismissed in the same instant. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said in English, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Welcome to Le Jardin. My name is Margot, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with something to drink?" The man at the head of the table didn't look at her. Instead, he turned to one of his companions and spoke in rapid French, his accent revealing years spent in Paris. "Tell the chef we want the tasting menu, all 8 courses, and bring the Chateau Margaux, the 96 if they have it." His companion shifted uncomfortably. "I don't speak French, Mr. Castellano." The silence that followed made the air feel heavy. "Mr." Castellano's jaw tightened, and Margot watched his hands curl into fists on the white tablecloth. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously soft. "You told me you spoke French. You said you could handle negotiations with the suppliers in Montreal." "I said I was learning," the man replied, his face going pale. "I've been using apps, but Apps. Castellano's laugh held no humor. We're about to finalize a deal worth $15 million, and you've been using apps. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. The other men at the table had gone very still, the way animals freeze when a predator is near. Margot remained by the door, her order pad clutched in her hands, waiting for permission to leave or stay. Castellano turned his attention back to his companions, switching to French again. His words came fast and harsh, a stream of profanity and insults that questioned the man's intelligence, his competence, and his value to their organization. Margot caught every word, her grandmother's language as familiar to her as breathing, and she felt her face flush with secondhand embarrassment for the man being eviscerated. This is what incompetence looks like, Castellano continued in French, his voice dripping with contempt, surrounded by idiots who can't even manage basic business requirements. My father would have had him beaten for wasting this much of my time. The man being insulted stared at his hands, clearly not understanding but reading the tone accurately enough. The others exchanged uncomfortable glances, their own French apparently limited to a few basic phrases at best. Margot should have stayed silent. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to keep her mouth shut, deliver whatever drinks they wanted, and get out of that room as quickly as possible. These were not people to antagonize. Laurent's warning echoed in her mind. But she thought of Colette, 15 years old and terrified of the world after their mother's death. She thought of the landlord who looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe when she asked for a few extra days to make rent. She thought of every man who had assumed she was weak or stupid because she served food for a living. And she spoke. Je comprends tout ce que vous dites. She said clearly, her accent flawless. I understand everything you're saying. The room went absolutely silent. Castellano's head snapped toward her, his blue eyes widening in genuine shock. The other men turned to stare, confusion evident on their faces as they tried to process what had just happened. Margot felt her pulse hammering in her throat, but she kept her chin up and maintained eye contact. In for a penny, in for a pound, as her grandmother used to say. Vous avez dit que vous vouliez le menu dégustation et le Château Margaux 426. Y informerai le chef. Quelque chose d'autre. She had told him she understood his request for the tasting menu and the wine, and asked if he needed anything else. The French rolled off her tongue naturally, her grandmother's Parisian accent coloring every syllable. The color in Castellano's face shifted from surprise to something that might have been embarrassment, then quickly hardened into something more dangerous. His eyes narrowed as he studied her with new intensity, and Margot felt every instinct screaming that she had made a terrible mistake. How much did you understand? He asked in French, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable threat. Margot's hands tightened on her order pad. She could lie, pretend she'd only caught a few words. But something in his expression told her he would know. Men like this were experts at detecting deception. Tout, she replied simply. Everything. One of the other men leaned forward. What's happening? What did she say? Castellano held up a hand, silencing him without breaking eye contact with Margot. When he spoke again, still in French, his tone had shifted slightly. The rage was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or calculation. Where did you learn to speak like that? He asked. Your accent is Parisian. Not many Americans speak French that well, especially not waitresses in Chicago. The word waitress carried a subtle emphasis, a reminder of the power imbalance between them. Margot lifted her chin. My grandmother was from the 6th arrondissement. She raised me after my parents died. We spoke nothing but French at home. The 6th arrondissement, Castellano repeated, leaning back in his chair. Near the Luxembourg Gardens, I assume. Very refined neighborhood. What's a girl with that background doing serving tables? The question felt like a test, designed to put her in her place. Margot met his gaze steadily. My grandmother's pension didn't follow her to America, and I have a 15-year-old sister with type 1 diabetes who needs insulin that costs $900 a month. Would you prefer I find a different career that pays better? The sarcasm in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension even if they couldn't understand the man. Words. To her surprise, Castellano smiled. It was a small expression, barely lifting the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his face entirely. You have courage, he said. Either that or you're incredibly foolish. I haven't decided which yet. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. Sit down. Margot blinked. I'm working. And now you're sitting. I'm not accustomed to repeating myself. The command in his voice was absolute, brooking no argument. Laurent would have her head for this. But refusing seemed more dangerous than complying. Margot set down her order pad and moved to the indicated chair, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her server's uniform beside these men in their $1,000 suits. Castellano switched to English, addressing his companions. Gentlemen, it appears we've found our solution to the Montreal problem. This young woman speaks French like a native. He turned back to Margot, switching languages again. What's your name? Margot. Duchamp. Margot, he repeated, as if tasting the sound of it. I'm Luca Castellano. I run several businesses in Chicago, including import operations that require frequent communication with our French-Canadian partners. My associate here, he gestured to the man he'd been berating earlier, has proven inadequate for the task. The man in question flushed red but said nothing. I need someone who can translate during business meetings and phone calls. The pay would be considerably better than what you make here. Luca pulled a business card from his jacket and placed it on the table in front of her. Call my office tomorrow. We'll discuss the details. Margot stared at the card. Heavy stock, embossed lettering. Luca Castellano, CEO, Castellano Enterprises. A phone number, nothing more. Every instinct was screaming warnings. Men like this didn't offer opportunities out of kindness. There would be strings attached, obligations she couldn't foresee, and the way Laurent had warned her to be careful. The tension radiating from these men, the casual mention of suppliers in Montreal for a deal worth $15 million. None of it pointed to legitimate business. But $900 for Colette's insulin, 2 months behind on rent with an eviction notice already taped to her door. The electricity bill she'd been ignoring because she couldn't figure out how to rob Peter to pay Paul when they were both already bankrupt. I'll think about it, she said finally, not touching the card. Luca's smile widened slightly. You'll think about it, he repeated, and somehow made it sound like she'd already agreed. Fair enough. Now why don't you take our drink orders in that lovely French of yours, and we'll enjoy our dinner. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Margot took orders, served courses, refilled wine glasses, all while acutely aware of Luca's eyes following her movements around the room. He engaged her in conversation whenever she approached the table, asking questions in French that seemed casual but felt like an examination. What did she study in school? Where did her grandmother live in Paris? Had she ever traveled to Montreal? Each answer was filed away with the precision of someone building a dossier. The other men grew louder as the wine flowed, their conversation peppered with references Margot tried not to hear. Territory disputes, shipment schedules, names she recognized from news reports about organized crime. She kept her expression neutral, her service impeccable, and tried to convince herself she was imagining the danger surrounding her. When the check finally came, Luca signed it without looking at the total. Inside the leather folder, Margot found $500 bills folded neatly. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked them up. 50% tip on a $4,000 meal. More money than she'd made in the last 2 weeks combined. For your excellent service, Luca said in French as the group prepared to leave. And because I suspect you need it more than I do. He paused by her chair, close enough that she caught the scent of expensive cologne and something sharper beneath it. Gun oil, perhaps. Call tomorrow, Margot. This opportunity won't wait forever. Then he was gone, his entourage following like a well-trained pack. The private dining room felt suddenly empty without their overwhelming presence. Margot sank into one of the chairs, her legs shaking. The $500 felt heavy in her pocket, and Luca's business card sat on the table where he'd left it, innocuous and dangerous all at once. What happened in there? Laurent appeared in the doorway, his face tight with concern. I saw who that was. Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into? Who is he? Margot asked, though she already suspected the answer. Laurent closed the door carefully before responding. Luca Castellano. His family runs most of the import operations on the north side. Shipping, distribution, some legitimate businesses mixed in with. He trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. People who work for the Castellanos don't quit that job, Margot. Once you're in, you're in. The warning settled over her like a shroud. Margot looked down at the business card, thinking of Colette's medication, of the eviction notice, of the electricity bill. Of all the ways her carefully constructed life was crumbling despite her best efforts to hold it together. "I'm just a waitress," she said finally. "He probably won't even remember me tomorrow." But she took the card with her when she left that night, tucked into her wallet like a promise or a threat. And she knew, with certainty that made her stomach twist, that Luca Castellano was not a man who forgot anything. The apartment Margot shared with Colette was a third-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better days sometime around the Nixon administration. The stairs creaked ominously, the radiator clanged all night, and the windows didn't quite close properly, letting in drafts that made winter unbearable. But it was home, and until the eviction notice, Margot had thought they might manage to keep it. She let herself in quietly, hoping Colette was already asleep. No such luck. Her sister sat at their tiny kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and papers, her insulin pump visible through her thin t-shirt. "You're late," Colette said without looking up from her chemistry homework. At 15, she had their grandmother's delicate features and their mother's sharp intelligence. She also had a chronic illness that cost more than Margot made in a month, and the quiet resilience of someone who'd learned too young that life wasn't fair. Big party. VIP room. Margot set her bag on the counter and pulled out the $500, spreading the bills on the table. "Look." Colette's eyes widened. "Holy shit. What did you do, rob someone?" Language. The correction was automatic. "No, just a very generous tip from a very strange evening." She told Colette about the dinner, editing out the darker implications. A businessman who needed a translator. Good money for simple work. She didn't mention Laurent's warning or the way Luca's smile had felt like a trap closing around her. "You should do it," Colette said immediately. "If he's offering real money, you'd be stupid not to at least hear him out. It might not be that simple. It never is." Colette returned to her homework, but not before Margot caught the worry in her eyes. "We're 2 months behind on rent, Margot. Mrs. Kowalski already told me she saw the eviction notice, and I need my prescription refilled next week." The weight of responsibility settled over Margot's shoulders like a familiar coat. She'd been carrying it since their mother died 3 years ago, leaving behind 2 daughters and a mountain of debt. Margot had been 20, in her second year at Northwestern studying French literature. Colette had been 12, newly diagnosed with diabetes, terrified and grieving. The choice had been simple then. Drop out, get a job, keep them afloat. She'd told herself it was temporary, that she'd go back to school once things stabilized. 3 years later, she was still telling herself that lie. "I'll call him tomorrow," Margot said finally, "just to hear what he's offering. No commitments." But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of France, she knew the decision had already been made. Desperation had a way of narrowing your options until there was really only one path forward, however dangerous it might be. Her phone rang at 9 the next morning, an unknown number with a Chicago area code. Margot answered, still half asleep, and a woman's crisp voice asked if she was Margot Duchamp. "Mr. Castellano would like to see you this afternoon, 2 o'clock at his office. I'm texting you the address now. Please be prompt." The call disconnected, before Margot could respond. A moment later, her phone buzzed with an address in the Loop, one of Chicago's most expensive business districts. She spent the next several hours trying to convince herself she could still back out. She could ignore the summons, throw away the business card, pretend the entire evening had never happened. But Colette needed insulin, their landlord needed rent, and Margot needed to believe there was some way out of the endless cycle of barely surviving that had become their lives. At 1:30, she dressed in the only professional outfit she owned, a black pencil skirt and white blouse she'd bought for job interviews that never panned out. She pulled her hair into a neat bun, applied minimal makeup, and studied herself in the mirror. She looked young and nervous, and completely out of her depth. Perfect, she thought bitterly. Exactly what I am. The building that housed Castellano Enterprises was all steel and glass, the kind of place where security guards scrutinized visitors and everything smelled like money. Margot gave her name at the desk, and was directed to the 42nd floor. The elevator ride felt like ascending to another world. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that could have been featured in an architecture magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago, and the furniture was all clean lines and expensive leather. Miss Duchamp, the woman from the phone, appeared, immaculate in a designer suit. "Please follow me." They walked down a hallway lined with original artwork, past offices where people worked at computers or spoke on phones in low, urgent voices. Everything was hushed, efficient, radiating an atmosphere of serious business conducted by serious people. Luca's office was at the end of the hall, behind double doors that his assistant opened without knocking. He stood by the windows, phone to his ear, speaking rapid Italian. When he saw Margot, he held up one finger and finished his conversation. Margot. He ended the call and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. The office was enormous, with the same stunning views and expensive furnishings as the reception area. But what caught Margot's attention was the wall of photographs behind his desk. Images of shipping containers, warehouses, what looked like a manufacturing facility, all legitimate business operations, she assumed, or fronts for something else. I'll be direct, Luca said, settling into his chair with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in his domain. I need a translator for meetings with my Montreal partners. The work would involve approximately 15 to 20 hours per week, mostly evenings and weekends. I'm offering $5,000 per month, plus coverage for any medical expenses you or your sister might incur. Margot's breath caught. $5,000. It was more than she made in 3 months at the problem restaurant. It would solve every immediate problem they faced, with money left over for things like groceries that weren't about to expire and winter coats that actually kept out the cold. What kind of business do you conduct with Montreal? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady. Luca smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. Import and distribution. Primarily luxury goods and specialty items. Nothing you need to worry about beyond translating the conversations accurately. The answer was too vague, too carefully worded. And if I see or hear things during these meetings that make me uncomfortable, then you'll remember that discretion is part of what I'm paying for. Luca leaned forward, his expression hardening slightly. Let me be very clear, Margot. This is a business arrangement. You translate, you keep your mouth shut about anything you see or hear, and you get paid extraordinarily well for a few hours of work each week. Those are the terms. Non-negotiable. There it was, the reality beneath the generous offer. She would be complicit in whatever his business truly involved, bound by money and fear to keep his secrets. Margot thought of Colette, of the medication she needed to stay alive, of the eviction notice that would become a reality in less than a week. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived the German occupation of Paris and later built a life in America through sheer, stubborn will. What would she say about this choice? But her grandmother had never had to watch a child suffer because she couldn't afford medicine, had never faced the particular crushing desperation of American poverty, where one medical emergency could destroy years of careful planning. When would I start? Margot asked. Luca's smile returned, triumphant now. Tonight. We have a video conference with our Montreal partners at 7. I'll send a car for you at 6:30. He slid a contract across the desk, several pages of dense legal text that probably contained clauses she should scrutinize carefully. But Margot barely glanced at it before signing her name at the bottom. She was already in too deep to worry about the fine print. Welcome to Castellano Enterprises, Margot, Luca said, his voice rich with satisfaction. I think this is going to be a very profitable relationship for both of us. As Margot left his office, clutching a copy of the contract and a check for her first month's salary, she caught her reflection in the elevator doors. She still looked young and nervous, but now there was something else in her eyes. The recognition of a line crossed, a choice made that couldn't be unmade. She pulled out her phone and called Colette. Order your prescription, she said when her sister answered. And tell Mrs. Kowalski we'll have the rent money tomorrow. You took the job? I took the job. Colette's whoop of joy should have made Margot smile. Instead, she felt a cold weight settling in her chest, the certainty that she had just sold, something valuable for temporary relief. But what choice did she have? What choice had she ever had? The elevator descended, carrying her back down to ground level, to the world where people like her struggled and sacrificed, and made impossible decisions just to survive. Upstairs, in his glass tower, Luca Castellano had added another piece to his organization, a translator who spoke flawless French and needed money desperately enough to ignore every warning sign. She was in now. And as Laurent had said, once you were in, there was no easy way out. The car that arrived for Margot that evening was not what she expected. A sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows, driven by a man in a dark suit who opened the door for her without speaking. The interior smelled of leather and something subtle she couldn't identify: wealth, perhaps, or danger. They were the same thing in Luca Castellano's world. The drive took them back to the loop, but this time to a different building, older and less ostentatious than Castellano Enterprises. The driver led her through a service entrance, up a freight elevator, and into a sprawling loft that had been converted into what looked like a war room. Maps covered one wall, marked with colored pins and handwritten notes. Computer monitors displayed shipping manifests and financial spreadsheets. 3 men worked at various stations, all of them looking up when Margot entered. "The translator," one of them said, his tone dismissive. He was younger than the others, maybe 30, with the kind of carefully cultivated stubble that required more effort than just not shaving. "She looks like she should be serving coffee, not handling sensitive negotiations." "Marco." Luca's voice cut through the room like a blade. He emerged from an interior office, dressed more casually now in dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. "Mind your manners, or I'll send you back to managing the restaurant supply operations. See how you like. Negotiating with produce vendors." Marco's face flushed, but he turned back to his computer without another word. Luca gestured for Margot to follow him into a conference room dominated by a large table and an enormous screen on the far wall. "Ignore Marco. He's still bitter about being replaced." Luca pulled out a chair for her, an oddly courteous gesture that didn't match the dangerous undertones of everything around them. "The Montreal group will be on screen. They're expecting to negotiate terms for a new distribution route through the St. Lawrence corridor. Your job is simple. Translate exactly what they say, exactly what I say. No editorializing, no interpretation beyond the literal words. Understood?" "Understood." Margot set her bag on the table, pulling out a notebook and pen. "Should I take notes? If you think it will help you remember details accurately. But those notes stay in this building. You don't take them home. You don't photograph them. You don't discuss them with anyone." His blue eyes held hers, and the casual warmth from earlier had vanished completely. This was the man who had built a criminal empire, who commanded loyalty through fear and calculated violence. "Are we clear?" "Crystal." The video call connected at precisely 7 o'clock. 4 men appeared on screen, seated around a similar conference table in what looked like an upscale office. The man at the center was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years outdoors before finding his way to air-conditioned power. "Monsieur Castellano," he said, his Quebec French distinct from Margot's Parisian accent. "On time as always. I appreciate a man who respects schedules. Monsieur Dubois." Luca inclined his head slightly. "Thank you for making time for this discussion. I understand you've been considering other partnerships." Margot translated smoothly, adjusting her accent slightly to match the Montreal businessman's style while keeping Luca's, meaning precise. The conversation that followed was a careful dance of implications and coded language. Distribution routes became logistics channels. Product became inventory. Payments became operational investments. But Margot wasn't stupid. She'd grown up in Chicago, had seen enough news reports to understand the euphemisms. They were discussing drug trafficking, money laundering, and territorial agreements between criminal organizations. And she was facilitating every word of it. Her hands trembled slightly as she took notes, but her voice remained steady. When Dubois made a joke about the complications of dealing with rival organizations in Toronto, she translated the humor without flinching, even though she understood he was talking about violence, possibly murder. The negotiation lasted 2 hours. By the end, they'd established new terms for whatever illegal operations connected Chicago and Montreal, with profit margins and delivery schedules that would have impressed any legitimate business school. Margot's head ached from the concentration required to maintain perfect accuracy, while her conscience screamed warnings about every word she spoke. "Excellent work," Luca said after the call ended. He stood, stretching muscles that had been held too still for too long. "Your French is even better than I thought." Dubois commented on it, said you sound like you could have grown up in the 16th arrondissement yourself. My grandmother would have been pleased. The words came out more bitter than Margot intended. She gathered her notes, handing them to Luca as instructed. "Is that all for tonight?" "Not quite." Luca moved to a cabinet against the wall, pulling out a bottle of cognac and 2 glasses. "We should celebrate your first successful translation. I don't drink on the job. The job is finished. Now we're just 2 people having a conversation." He poured anyway, sliding 1 glass across the table toward her. "Tell me, Margot, what did you think of our discussion tonight?" It was a trap. Every instinct told her to deflect, to claim ignorance, to pretend she'd been nothing more than a voice translating sounds without processing meaning. But something in Luca's expression suggested he'd see through any attempt at deception. "I think," she said carefully, "that I translated exactly what was said, exactly as you requested." Luca's laugh was genuine this time, warming his features in a way that made him look younger, less dangerous, diplomatic, smart. He sipped his cognac, studying her over the rim of the glass. "Most people in your position would either be horrified or thrilled. You seem to be neither." "I'm practical." Margot picked up the glass he'd poured for her but didn't drink. "You're paying me well to do a job. I'm doing that job. What I think about the content is irrelevant." "Is it?" Luca leaned back in his chair, and Margot noticed for the first time how the casual pose didn't fully conceal the weapon holstered, at his side. She'd been in the same room with an armed criminal for hours, translating plans for illegal operations, and only now did the full reality of her situation sink in with visceral clarity. "You're afraid," Luca observed, his tone neutral. "You're hiding it well, but I can see it. Your hands shook twice during the call, and you haven't touched that cognac despite clearly needing something to steady your nerves." Margot set the glass down with deliberate care. "Would you respect me more if I pretended not to be afraid?" "I respect you more for being afraid and doing the job anyway." He finished his drink and stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "The car will take you home, tomorrow evening, same time. We have a face-to-face meeting with some of Dubois's people who are flying in from Montreal. Dressed professionally, these men put stock in appearances." The driver who'd brought her was waiting by the elevator, and the ride home passed in silence. Margot stared out the window at Chicago's glittering skyline, thinking about the $5,000 that would hit her account tomorrow, thinking about Colette's insulin and their rent and all the mundane necessities that money would cover, thinking about how easily she'd slipped into complicity with criminals because the alternative was watching her sister suffer. Colette was asleep when Margot got home, her insulin pump humming softly beside the bed. Margot stood in the doorway, watching her sister's chest rise and fall with each breath, and felt the weight of her choices pressing down like a physical force. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though Colette couldn't hear. "I'm so sorry." But she wasn't sorry enough to stop, and that truth terrified her more than anything Luca Castellano could do. The pattern established itself quickly over the following weeks. Margot continued her day shifts at Le Jardin, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while her evenings belonged to Luca's organization. She translated video conferences, phone calls, and increasingly, in-person meetings with men whose names she recognized from news reports about organized crime. The money transformed their lives with startling speed. Colette's insulin was never late. Their rent was paid in full, a month in advance. Margot bought groceries without checking prices, replaced their dying refrigerator, got Colette the new laptop she needed for school. Small luxuries that should have felt like victories instead felt like blood money, earned through careful blindness to the truth of what she was helping facilitate. "You seem different," Colette observed one evening, watching Margot get ready for another translation session. "Happier, maybe? Or just less stressed?" "Money helps." Margot fastened her watch new, purchased after Luca had commented that showing up with a broken timepiece looked unprofessional. When you're not constantly worried about keeping the lights on, everything else gets easier. "Is the job okay?" "You don't talk about it much." Because talking about it would mean confronting what she was doing. Margot forced a smile. "It's fine. Boring business meetings mostly, but the pay makes boring worthwhile." Colette seemed to accept this, returning to her homework, while Margot finished preparing. The lies were getting easier. That should have worried her more than it did. That night's meeting was different from the usual video conferences. Dubois and two of his associates had flown in from Montreal, and Luca had arranged dinner at a private club Margot hadn't known existed. The kind of place without signs, where membership was by invitation only, and security wore suits that couldn't quite hide their weapons. Margot arrived to find Luca already there, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. He stood when she entered the private dining room, a gesture of courtesy that seemed at odds with everything she knew about him. "You look lovely," he said, and she hated that the compliment made her feel warm. He was a criminal, a dangerous man who'd pulled her into his world through financial desperation, and was now making her complicit in activities she didn't want to examine too closely. But he'd also saved her sister's life by making insulin affordable, had ensured they had a safe place to live, had treated her with more respect than most of the legitimate businessmen she'd encountered during her brief time at Northwestern. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The world wasn't as simple as good and evil, Margot was learning. Sometimes it was just varying shades of gray, and you did what you had to do to survive. Dubois arrived with his associates, all of them dressed for business and carrying themselves with the casual confidence of men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted. The oldest associate, a man Dubois introduced as Jean-Baptiste, studied Margot with undisguised interest. "So young to be involved in such delicate matters," he said in French, his tone suggesting he found her presence amusing rather than problematic. "Does she understand what she's translating, Luca? Or have you kept her innocent?" Margot translated his words faithfully, watching Luca's jaw tighten at the implied insult. But his response was measured, calm. Margot understands discretion, which is all that matters. Her personal opinions about our business are her own concern. The dinner proceeded with the careful choreography of any important business negotiation. 7 courses, each paired with wine that probably cost more than Margot's monthly salary at the restaurant. She sat beside Luca, translating the conversation that flowed between courses. Her presence acknowledged but largely ignored after the initial introductions. It was during the 4th course duck breast with a cherry reduction that would have made Pierre Beaumont weep with envy that the conversation shifted from business to something more personal. Jean-Baptiste, several glasses of wine deep, leaned forward with a conspiratorial smile. "Your translator is beautiful, Luca. Is she also available for other services? I'm sure we could negotiate an arrangement that would be profitable for everyone involved." The words hung in the air like poison. Margot felt her face flush hot with humiliation and anger, but she forced her voice to remain steady as she translated the proposition. Luca's expression didn't change, but something in the room's atmosphere shifted dramatically. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. His hand, which had been resting casually on the table, curled into a fist. "Margot is my employee," he said, each word precisely articulated in English before she could translate. "She is not, nor will she ever be, available for anything beyond translation services. And if you make another suggestion like that, Jean-Baptiste, you'll find that our business relationship becomes significantly less profitable." The threat was clear enough that even Dubois looked uncomfortable. Jean-Baptiste raised his hands in mock surrender, laughing as if it had all been a joke, but Margot saw the flash of anger in his eyes before he concealed it. The rest of the dinner passed with forced civility. The negotiation successfully concluded despite the awkward moment. When the Montreal delegation finally departed, Margot found herself alone with Luca in the private dining room. The detritus of their meal spread across the table like evidence of excess. "I apologize for Jean-Baptiste's behavior," Luca said, pouring himself another glass of wine. "Some men forget there are lines that shouldn't be crossed." "You defended me." Margot heard the surprise in her own voice. "You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did." Luca looked genuinely puzzled by her reaction. "You work for me. That means you're under my protection. No one disrespects my people without consequences. His people. The phrase should have felt like ownership, like being claimed as property. Instead, it felt oddly like safety, and that confused Margot more than anything else that had happened that evening. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "There must be other translators in Chicago, people with experience in your kind of business. Why offer the job to a waitress you'd just met?" Luca was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass as he considered his answer. "Because you stood up to me that first night," he said finally. "Most people either grovel or challenge with empty bravado. You did neither. You simply spoke truth without fear or pretense, and I found that refreshing." "Truth," Margot laughed, the sound bitter even to her own ears. "I lie every day now. To my sister, to my colleagues at the restaurant, to myself about what I'm really doing here. You facilitate communication. Nothing more, nothing less." Luca set down his glass and turned to face her directly. "What we discuss in those meetings, the decisions made, none of that is your responsibility. You're simply the bridge between languages. That's a convenient fiction, perhaps. But it's the fiction that allows you to sleep at night, isn't it?" His perception cut too close to the bone. Margot stood, gathering her bag and coat. "I should go. It's late. The car is waiting." Luca stood as well, and for a moment they were close enough that Margot could smell his cologne, I could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow that she'd never noticed before. Same time tomorrow. We have another call with the Toronto group. But as she moved toward the door, Luca's hand caught her wrist gently, not restraining, just holding. Margot. What Jean-Baptiste suggested tonight, that will never happen. You're safe here. I need you to believe that. The sincerity in his voice almost undid her. How could a man who orchestrated illegal activities across international borders, who spoke casually of violence and territorial disputes, sound so genuinely concerned about her well-being? I believe you, she said quietly, and realized with a start that she meant it. The drive home gave her too much time to think. About Luca's defense of her, his insistence that she was under his protection, about the strange intimacy of their working relationship, the long hours spent in close quarters translating conversations that revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. She was learning things about him that went beyond the business. That he'd grown up in Little Italy, the son of an immigrant father who'd built the organization from nothing. That his mother had died when he was 17, and he still visited her grave every Sunday. That he spoke 3 languages fluently and read voraciously, his office lined with books in Italian, English, and French. He was becoming real to her. Not just a dangerous abstraction, but a person with dimensions and contradictions. And that was perhaps the most dangerous development of all. 3 weeks into her new position, Margot arrived at the loft to find unusual activity. More men than normal, all of them armed, all of them tense. Marco stood at the main computer station, his face tight with worry as he coordinated something on multiple screens. What's happening? Margot asked, setting down her bag. Security situation. Marco didn't look at her. His attention focused on whatever crisis was unfolding. Luca wants you in the conference room. Don't ask questions. Just translate what he tells you to translate. The conference room was crowded. Luca sat at the head of the table, flanked by 4 men Margot recognized as his senior associates. All of them wore expressions that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Margot, good. Luca gestured to the seat beside him. We have a problem. The Kozlov organization in Toronto is moving against our distribution network. Dubois just called 3 of his men were killed this morning in what's being reported as a restaurant shooting. Margot's mouth went dry. People were dead. Men she might have met during one of the negotiations, reduced to casualties in a war she'd helped facilitate through her translations. I need you to translate a call with Kozlov's representative. We're going to attempt to negotiate a ceasefire before this escalates into open warfare. Luca's voice was hard. All business now. Can you handle that? Could she? Margot's hands were shaking again, but she nodded. Yes. The call connected minutes later. The man on screen was younger than Margot expected, maybe 40, with pale eyes and a smile that never reached them. He spoke French with a heavy Russian accent, his words precise and cold. Mr. Castellano, I understand you're upset about the unfortunate incident in Montreal. Please accept my condolences, Margot translated, her voice steadier than she felt. Luca's response was measured but carried an unmistakable edge. Upset is a mild word for my reaction to 3 of my partner's men being executed. We had an agreement about respecting territorial boundaries. Agreements can be renegotiated. The Russian's smile widened slightly. The market conditions have changed. Your Montreal operations have become inefficient. We're simply offering to streamline the logistics. Back and forth it went, a dance of threats and counter-threats wrapped in polite business language. But the undercurrent was clear. The Kozlov organization wanted Luca's territory, and they were willing to kill for it. During a pause while the Russian consulted with someone off-screen, Luca leaned close to Margot. If this goes badly, you need to leave Chicago tonight. I'll arrange everything: new identification, money, a place in Seattle where my organization has no presence. You'll be safe. What? Margot stared at him. Why would I need to leave? Because if Kozlov decides to move against me directly, he'll use anyone close to me as leverage. You've been seen at enough meetings now that you're a known associate. That makes you a target. The words hit like ice water. She wasn't just complicit anymore. She was in danger because of her association with Luca's world. The Russian returned to screen before Margot could process this new reality. We've reached a decision, he said in French. You have 72 hours to withdraw from the Montreal operations. After that, anyone representing Castellano interests in Quebec becomes a legitimate target. Margot translated. watching Luca's face harden into something terrifying. When he responded, his voice was soft, almost gentle, and somehow that made the threat even more chilling. Tell Mr. Kozlov that if any more of my people are harmed, I will personally ensure that his organization's operations in North America become significantly more complicated. I have friends in places he hasn't even considered. And unlike him, I'm patient enough to wait for the right moment to demonstrate exactly what happens to people who break agreements with me. The call ended shortly after, neither side yielding but both understanding that the situation had escalated beyond simple negotiation. As the screen went dark, Luca stood and addressed the room in rapid Italian, issuing orders that sent his men scrambling to implement enhanced security measures. Then he turned to Margot, his expression softening slightly. I'm having you move to a secure apartment tonight. You can't go back to your current place, it's too easy to find. My sister will be moved as well, with a full security detail. Don't argue with me on this, Margot. The Kozlov organization doesn't play by the rules we observe. If they think hurting you or your sister will give them leverage against me, they won't hesitate. The world was tilting beneath Margot's feet. Less than a month ago, her biggest worry had been making rent. Now she was being relocated under guard because Russian criminals might target her to get to her employer. This is insane, she whispered. This is the world you entered when you took my money. Luca's tone was firm but not unkind. I warned you that discretion was required. That includes accepting the protection I provide when your association with me becomes dangerous. 2 hours later, Margot and Colette were being escorted into a luxury apartment in a secured building downtown. Armed men stationed themselves in the hallway, while Margot tried to explain to her terrified sister why they'd been ripped from their lives with only the clothes they were wearing and whatever could be hastily packed in 20 minutes. Is this because of your translation job? Colette demanded, her voice shaking. What kind of business are you really involved in? Margot couldn't answer. The truth would destroy the careful illusions she'd built. So she did what she'd been doing for weeks, she lied. It's just a precaution. Some business rivals are making threats, and Mr. Castellano wants to ensure his employees are safe. It's temporary, I promise. But looking at the armed guards outside their door, at the luxurious apartment that felt more like a gilded cage than salvation, Margot wondered if anything about her new life would ever be temporary again. She'd wanted security for herself and Colette. Now she had it, but the price was their freedom. And the man who'd promised to protect them was the same one who'd dragged them into danger in the first place. Luca Castellano had become her employer, her protector, and her prison guard, all in the space of a few short weeks. And Margot was beginning to realize that the real danger wasn't the Russian criminals making threats. It was how easily she'd allowed herself to become dependent on a man whose power came from activities she'd once have condemned without hesitation. The line between captor and protector was thinner than she'd ever imagined, and she'd crossed it so gradually that she hadn't even noticed when survival became complicity. And complicity became something that felt disturbingly like belonging. The luxury apartment became their prison for 6 days. Margot counted each one like a sentence being served, watching Colette grow increasingly restless and withdrawn. Her sister had stopped asking questions after the first night, retreating instead into a sullen silence that spoke volumes about her growing understanding of their situation. On the morning of the 7th day, Luca arrived unannounced. Margot heard the guards acknowledge him in the hallway before the door opened. He looked tired. She noticed the kind of exhaustion that came from sleepless nights and constant vigilance. His suit was rumpled, his usual meticulous grooming slightly neglected. "We need to talk," he said simply, glancing toward Colette's closed bedroom door. Alone. They stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's skyline. From 40 stories up, the city looked beautiful and orderly, all clean lines and glittering glass. Nothing like the messy reality of what happened in its shadows. "The situation with Kozlov has been resolved," Luca began, choosing his words carefully. "He won't be a problem anymore." "What does resolved mean?" Margot asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "It means his organization no longer has the infrastructure to operate in North America. Assets were seized, key personnel were arrested, and Mr. Kozlov himself is currently explaining his activities to federal prosecutors." Luca's expression was neutral, but Margot caught the hint of satisfaction beneath it. "I told you I had friends in places he hadn't considered. You had him arrested." The realization came with a strange mix of relief and horror. You used law enforcement against a rival criminal. I used every resource at my disposal to protect my people. That includes you and your sister. Luca turned to face her directly. You're safe now, Margot. You can go home, back to your regular apartment if you prefer. The immediate danger has passed. It should have been good news, freedom to return to their lives, such as they were. But Margot found herself hesitating, looking around the apartment that had felt like a cage but also provided a security she'd never known before. What about the long term? She heard herself ask. What happens the next time a rival organization decides to move against you? Do we go through this again? Luca was quiet for a moment. That's the question, isn't it? He moved to the kitchen, helping himself to coffee from the pot that was always kept fresh by the building staff. I can keep paying you to translate. You can continue living on the edge of my world, always one crisis away from being dragged back into protective custody. Or you could work for me full-time. Not just as a translator, but as part of my legitimate operations. He set down his cup, his expression serious. I'm in the process of restructuring several businesses. The import company, the restaurants, the real estate holdings, they're all profitable on their own. I've been looking for someone intelligent, trustworthy, and fluent in multiple languages to help manage international partnerships. You're offering me a real job. Margot couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. In your legitimate businesses, which are completely separate from my other activities. Luca's tone suggested he knew she wouldn't entirely believe that separation. Full salary, benefits, an office at Castellano Enterprises, your sister would have the best medical coverage available. You could even finish your degree, I'd cover the tuition. It was everything Margot had wanted before her mother died. Security, opportunity, the chance to complete her education. All of it offered by a man whose wealth came from activities she still refused to examine too closely. Why? The question emerged rawer than she intended. Why would you do this? Luca studied her for a long moment before answering. Because in the month you've worked for me, you've proven yourself more capable and trustworthy than people I've known for years. Because your sister deserves better than growing up in fear of eviction and medical bankruptcy. And because... He paused, something flickering across his face that looked almost vulnerable. Because I've grown accustomed to having you around, and I'd like to keep you close for reasons that go beyond your translation skills. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Margot's heart was racing, and she couldn't tell if it was fear or something more complicated. I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course. Luca retrieved his coat, preparing to leave. Take whatever time you need. The protection stays in place regardless of your decision. I don't abandon my people, Margot, whether you continue working for me or not. After he left, Margot stood at the window for a long time, watching the city below and trying to sort through the tangled mess of her feelings. Somewhere in the past month, Luca Castellano had stopped being simply her employer or the dangerous criminal who'd ensnared her. He'd become something more complex: protector, potential mentor, and if she was honest with herself, someone she looked forward to seeing more than she should. Colette emerged from her room, her expression wary. Was that him? The boss? Yes. He sounds different than I expected. Colette moved to stand beside her. Less scary, I guess. Almost normal. He's not normal, Margot said softly. He's very, very dangerous. But he kept us safe. Colette's voice was small, uncertain. When those other criminals were threatening us, he made sure we were protected. That counts for something, doesn't it? Out of the mouths of teenagers. Margot wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders, wondering when the world had become so morally complicated that a 15-year-old could see nuances she was still struggling to accept. They moved back to their original apartment the next day, though Margot noticed the two men in the car across the street who never seemed to leave. Protection or surveillance, probably both. She returned to Le Jardin for her regular shifts, falling back into the familiar rhythm of taking orders and delivering plates as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Pierre, the head chef and owner, called her into his office on her third day back. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. I've received an interesting offer, he said without preamble. Mr. Castellano wants to buy Le Jardin. He's offering significantly more than market value. Margot's stomach dropped. What? He says he's expanding his restaurant portfolio, wants to keep me on as head chef, Retain all current staff. Increase everyone's salary by 20%. Pierre's eyes narrowed. He also specifically mentioned ensuring you have whatever schedule flexibility you need for your other work obligations. The pieces clicked into place. Luca was buying the restaurant to give her stability, to create a safety net that didn't depend entirely on working for him directly. It was a grand gesture wrapped in business logic, and it terrified her with its implications. "Are you going to sell?" she asked. "That depends." Pierre leaned back in his chair. "What exactly is your relationship with Luca Castellano?" The question deserved honesty, but Margot didn't know how to explain something she barely understood herself. "He offered me translation work. High pay, flexible hours. I took it because I needed the money for my sister's medical care. And now? Now I'm trying to figure out if I'm an employee or a possession." Pierre's expression softened slightly. Men like Castellano don't make distinctions between the two. Everyone in their orbit belongs to them in some way. The question is whether you can live with that. Could she? Margot left his office without an answer, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. That evening, instead of going home, she found herself walking to the address she'd memorized from Luca's business card, Castellano Enterprises, 42nd floor. The security guard recognized her now, waving her through without questions. The elevator ride gave her too much time to second-guess this decision, but her feet kept moving forward anyway. Luca's assistant had left for the day, the reception area dark except for the ambient light from the city beyond the windows. Margot walked down the familiar hallway to his office, finding the door slightly ajar and light spilling from within. He sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and computer screens, reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that made him look almost scholarly. The image clashed so sharply with the dangerous criminal she knew him to be that Margot almost laughed. "You're buying Le Jardin," she said from the doorway. Luca looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he concealed it. He removed his glasses, setting them aside with deliberate care. "Pierre told you." "Why?" "Because it's a sound investment. The restaurant has an excellent reputation, a loyal clientele, and an award-winning chef who wants to stay on. From a business perspective, it's an obvious acquisition. And the personal perspective?" Margot stepped into his office, closing the door behind her. "The part where you're specifically ensuring I have schedule flexibility and a guaranteed position?" Luca stood, moving around his desk to lean against it, arms crossed. "I don't want you to feel trapped. If you decide not to work for me full-time, you should still have options. Security that doesn't depend on my continued employment. That's not how this works." Margot felt anger rising, though she couldn't entirely articulate why. "You can't just buy pieces of in my life and rearrange them to suit your preferences. I'm not one of your business assets to be managed and optimized. I never said you were. Then what am I?" The question came out more desperate than she intended. "Because I don't understand this. Any of this. You're a criminal who quotes literature and buys restaurants to give your translator job security. You defend my honor at business dinners and threaten people with federal prosecution to keep me safe. What am I supposed to do with that?" Luca was quiet for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing. Then he moved closer, close enough that Margot could see the faint silver in his dark hair, the scar tissue on his knuckles that spoke of violence in his past. "You're supposed to let someone take care of you for once," he said softly. "You've been holding your world together through sheer stubborn will since you were 20 years old. Raising your sister, working multiple jobs, sacrificing your education and your future to keep one person alive and safe. I'm offering you the chance to stop doing that alone." "In exchange for what?" Margot whispered. "Nothing you're not willing to give." His hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture startlingly gentle. I'm not asking you to compromise your morals any further than you already have. I'm not demanding your loyalty or your affection. I'm simply offering resources that I have in abundance to solve problems that have been crushing you. That's not how men like you operate." But even as she said it, Margot felt her certainty wavering. "There's always a price. The price is letting me be part of your life. Permanently." Luca's thumb traced along her jaw, his touch sending shivers down her spine. "I want you to work for me, yes. But more than that, I want you to trust me. To let me help you build something stable instead of constantly scrambling to survive. And what do you get out of this arrangement?" His smile was sad, almost self-deprecating. The company of someone who sees me as a person instead of a reputation. Someone who isn't afraid to call me out when I'm being an ass. Someone who makes me think about building something legitimate instead of just managing criminal enterprises until the feds finally catch up with me. The confession stripped away layers of careful control, revealing something raw beneath. Margot realized with a start that Luca was lonely, surrounded by people who feared or used him, never quite certain if anyone valued him beyond his power and resources. "I'm not some kind of redemption project," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "I know. You're a stubborn, brilliant woman who speaks 5 languages and makes my restaurant owners nervous with your talent." Luca's other hand came up to frame her face, holding her gently but firmly. "You're someone who stands up to dangerous men and then translates their threats without flinching. Someone who would sacrifice everything for family and doesn't know how to stop fighting even when the battle's won. You barely know me. I know enough." And then he kissed her. It wasn't aggressive or demanding. It was almost tentative, asking a question instead of claiming an answer. Margot's mind screamed. Warnings, this was her employer. A criminal. Someone who represented everything she should run from. But her body responded anyway. Leaning into the kiss, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. Because beneath all the danger and moral complications, there was something real here. A connection she'd been denying since that first night when he'd defended her honor against Jean-Baptiste's proposition. When they broke apart, Luca's expression was vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I'm not asking you to decide right now," he said quietly. "Take your time. Think about what you want, not just what you need. The job offer stands regardless. But I wanted you to know that this," he gestured between them, "this is separate from business. What happens between us personally is your choice, with no pressure or obligation." Margot stepped back, needing distance to think clearly. Her lips still tingled from the kiss, her heart racing with a mix of fear and something that felt dangerously like hope. "I need to go home," she managed. "I'll have a car. I'll take the train." She needed the time, the normalcy of public transportation and anonymous crowds. "I'll give you my answer about the job by the end of the week." Luca nodded, not pushing, respecting the boundary she was trying to establish even as they both knew it was already too late. The line between professional and personal had been obliterated the moment his lips touched hers. Margot fled his office, rode the elevator down to street level, and walked to the nearest L station. The train was crowded with evening commuters, normal people heading home from normal jobs, completely unaware of the criminal empires operating in the shadows of their city. She'd been one of them just a month ago. Now she was. What? A translator for the mob? A potential executive in a crime boss's legitimate business front? A woman falling for someone who ordered federal investigations the way other people ordered takeout? Her phone buzzed with a text. Not from Luca, but from Colette. "Mrs. Rodriguez from the clinic called. They have an opening for that specialist you've been trying to get me in to see. First available was 6 months out, but suddenly they can fit me in next week. Did you do something?" Margot closed her eyes, knowing without asking that Luca had made a call, pulled a string, used his influence to get a 15-year-old girl an appointment that normally required half a year of waiting. Another grand gesture, another demonstration of how much easier life could be with his resources behind them. Another chain linking her to a man who was systematically removing every reason she had to walk away. She typed back, "I'll make sure you don't miss it." Then she opened a new message to Luca. "Thank you for the doctor." His response came seconds later. "You don't need to thank me for doing what should have been automatic. Every child deserves access to health care." And there it was again, the contradiction that was Luca Castellano, a man who ran criminal operations but believed children deserved medical care, who ordered federal prosecutions against rivals but bought restaurants to give employees security, who kissed with unexpected tenderness and offered freedom while simultaneously making himself indispensable. Margot got off at her stop and walked the 3 blocks to her apartment, nodding to the men in the car who were still maintaining their protective surveillance. Inside, she found Colette doing homework at the kitchen table, looking healthier than she had in months, thanks to consistent access to insulin and proper nutrition. "Are you going to take the full-time job?" Colette asked without looking up from her chemistry textbook. "How did you know about that?" "I'm 15, not stupid. And Mr. Castellano's assistant called this afternoon about benefits enrollment if you decide to accept." Colette set down her pencil, meeting Margot's eyes directly. "I looked him up online." There are articles about his family, about investigations and suspected criminal activities. I know what he is. Margot's heart sank. Colette. But I also know he's kept us safe. He's made sure I have my insulin, that we have a place to live, that you're not working yourself to death trying to keep us afloat. Colette's voice was matter of fact. The pragmatism of a generation that had grown up with school shootings and climate anxiety. The world isn't good or bad anymore. It's just complicated. And sometimes you have to accept help from complicated people. When did you get so wise? When I almost died because we couldn't afford my medication, and I watched you drop out of school to save me. Colette returned to her homework. Take the job, Margot. Stop punishing yourself for doing what you had to do to survive. We're allowed to have good things, even if they come from imperfect sources. Margot wanted to argue, to explain why it wasn't that simple. But looking at her sister healthy, safe, focused on her education, instead of worrying about their next crisis, she couldn't find the words. Maybe Colette was right. Maybe survival meant accepting the complicated reality of their situation, instead of clinging to moral absolutes that had never kept them fed or housed. That night, Margot pulled out the course catalog from Northwestern University. She'd kept it all these years, a reminder of the life she'd planned before circumstances intervened. The French literature program she'd loved. The professors whose classes had made her feel alive with the beauty of language and story. She could finish her degree now. Luca had offered tuition coverage, and with a full-time position at Castellano Enterprises, she could afford to cut back her restaurant shifts to part-time. She could become the person she'd always wanted to be, just via a route she'd never imagined. But at what cost? And did the cost even matter if it gave both her and Colette the future they deserved? The decision crystallized 3 days later in the most unexpected way. Margot was at Le Jardin, working the lunch shift, when a woman approached her table. Mid-40s, dressed in a conservative suit that screamed federal law enforcement. She presented her credentials with practiced efficiency. Special Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. I need to speak with you about Luca Castellano. Margot's blood ran cold. She glanced around the restaurant, noting that 2 other suited individuals had positioned themselves near the exits. This wasn't a casual conversation. I'm working, she managed. This will only take a few minutes. Perhaps we could use the manager's office? It wasn't really a request. Laurent appeared at Margot's elbow, his face pale but composed. Use my office. I'll cover your tables. The office felt cramped with 3 people inside Agent Chen, Margot, and a male agent who introduced himself as Rodriguez. Chen opened a folder, pulling out photographs that made Margot's stomach turn. Surveillance photos of her entering Castellano Enterprises, leaving Luca's penthouse at 2 a.m. after a late translation session, getting into his car, sitting beside him at the dinner with Dubois. We've been investigating the Castellano organization for 18 months, Chen said, her tone professional but not unkind. We know you've been working as his translator. We know you've been present for meetings involving criminal negotiations. We know he's moved you into a secured apartment and provided armed protection. I translate business discussions, that's all. Margot's voice was steadier than she felt. Miss Duchamp, we also know about your sister's medical condition, about your financial difficulties. We understand how someone in your position might feel compelled to accept employment from someone like Castellano. Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression sympathetic. We're not here to arrest you or threaten you. We're here to offer you a way out. Chen pulled out another document. Witness protection. Full immunity in exchange for testimony about the criminal activities you've observed. New identities for both you and your sister, relocation to anywhere in the country, and financial support to complete your education. It was everything Margot should want. Freedom from Luca's world, legal protection, a clean slate, the moral high ground she'd been struggling to find since that first night at the restaurant. What exactly would you want me to testify about? She heard herself ask. Details of the meetings you've translated. Information about his business partners, particularly the Montreal operations. Evidence of criminal conspiracy and international drug trafficking. Chen's eyes were sharp, assessing. You're in a unique position, Miss Duchamp. You have access to conversations and information that could bring down one of Chicago's most significant criminal organizations. And if I refuse? Then you continue in your current situation, growing more complicit with each passing day. Rodriguez's voice was gentle but firm. Eventually, when we do build our case against Castellano, you could face charges as an accomplice. Conspiracy, money laundering, potentially more. Is that the future you want for yourself? For your sister? The walls of the small office felt like they were closing in. Margot's mind raced through scenarios, each one more complicated than the last. If she testified, Luca would go to prison. The man who'd defended her honor, protected her sister, offered her a path out of poverty, would be destroyed by her betrayal. But if she didn't, she was choosing his world over the law, choosing a criminal over justice. Except it wasn't that simple. It had never been that simple. I need time to think, Margot said finally. Chen handed her a business card. You have 48 hours. After that, we'll proceed with our investigation through other channels, and any opportunity for immunity expires. She stood, preparing to leave. One more thing, we have reason to believe rival organizations are aware of your relationship with Castellano. The protective custody he's providing isn't paranoia. You're genuinely in danger from people who would use you to get to him. After the agents left, Margot sat alone in Laurent's office for 20 minutes, trying to process everything. The FBI wanted her to betray Luca. Rival criminals wanted to use her against him. And Luca himself had bought a restaurant, offered her a career, and kissed her with a tenderness that suggested his feelings ran deeper than simple employer-employee relations. She was trapped in the center of forces pulling in different directions, and any choice she made would destroy some part of her life. Her phone buzzed. A text from Luca. Dinner tonight? I'd like to hear your decision about the job. No pressure. Margot stared at the message, Agent Chen's business card sitting on the desk beside her phone. Two paths, both leading to futures she couldn't fully envision. One represented the moral high ground, safety purchased through betrayal. The other offered security tainted by complicity, but built on something that felt increasingly like genuine connection. She thought about Colette's words. The world isn't good or bad anymore, it's just complicated. She thought about her grandmother, who'd survived German occupation by making impossible choices daily, doing whatever was necessary to protect her family. She thought about Luca's face when he'd said he wanted her to trust him. The vulnerability beneath his dangerous exterior. The loneliness of a man surrounded by people who served him but never truly knew him. And she made her choice. She texted back, "Dinner sounds good. And yes to the job. We should talk about everything else too." Then she took Agent Chen's card and tore it in half. The consequences of this decision would unfold in ways she couldn't predict. She would be choosing sides in a war she didn't fully understand, binding herself to a man whose world was built on activities she'd once condemned. But she would do it with her eyes open, accepting the moral complexity of survival in a world that had never been as black and white as she'd once believed. Margot returned to her shift, taking orders and serving customers as if her entire life hadn't just shifted on its axis. The FBI agents were gone, but she knew they'd be watching, waiting to see if she'd reconsider, if fear or conscience would drive her to accept their offer. They didn't understand that she'd already accepted a different offer, one that came with danger and moral compromise, but also with protection, opportunity, and something that felt disturbingly like belonging. She'd entered Luca Castellano's world out of desperation. Now she was choosing to stay for reasons far more complicated. And there was no going back from that choice. Dinner was at Luca's penthouse, not a restaurant. Margot arrived to find him cooking. Of all things, sleeves rolled up, concentrating on a pan of risotto with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations. "My grandmother's recipe," he explained, not looking up from stirring. She said a man who couldn't feed himself was no man at all. The domesticity of the scene jarred against everything Margot knew about him. But then, nothing about Luca Castellano had ever fit neatly into the categories she tried to assign him. "The FBI came to see me today," she said, deciding honesty was the only path forward. Luca's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. "I know. My people informed me." He set down the spoon, finally meeting her eyes. "And I told them I needed time to think. Then I tore up their card and texted you about dinner." Something in his expression shifted relief, perhaps mixed with something deeper. "You chose this. Me. Even knowing what it means. I chose not to betray someone who's kept their word to me." Margot moved closer, drawn by forces she'd stopped trying to resist. "You protected my sister, gave us security, never asked for anything I wasn't willing to give. The FBI offered witness protection, immunity, a clean conscience. But it would have been built on destroying someone who's been more honest with me than most legitimate people I've known." Luca pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. This won't be easy. The FBI will keep pressure on you. Rival organizations will always see you as potential leverage. In my world, it's never going to be completely safe or completely legal, no matter how many legitimate businesses I build. I know. And she did. Margot had walked into this with her eyes open, accepting the moral complexity of loving a man whose hands were stained with activities she couldn't fully condone, because that was the truth she'd finally admitted to herself. Somewhere between translation sessions and protective custody, between his defense of her honor and his tender kiss in his office, she'd fallen for Luca Castellano. Not the criminal, not the businessman. The complicated, contradictory man who contained multitudes. The job starts Monday, Luca said softly. Real office, real salary, real work in the legitimate import operations. I meant what I said. You can finish your degree, build a career that doesn't depend on criminal activity. I want better for you, even if I can't claim better for myself. What about us? Margot asked. Not employer-employee. What are we beyond that? Luca pulled back enough to look at her properly, his blue eyes searching hers. Whatever you want us to be. I'm not going to push for more than you're willing to give, but I need you to know that you've become important to me in ways that have nothing to do with business. The risotto was slightly overcooked by the time they remembered it existed. They ate anyway, sitting on his balcony overlooking the city, talking about everything except business, her grandmother's life in Paris, his mother's quiet strength, Colette's dreams of becoming a doctor, the books they'd both loved, the places they wanted to travel. For one evening, they were just two people sharing a meal and discovering each other beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. Later, as Luca drove her home, refusing to let her take the train despite her protests, Margot felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. It was fragile, built on foundations that might crumble under scrutiny. But it was real. The FBI won't give up, she said as they pulled up to her apartment. I know, but neither will I. Luca's hand found hers in the darkness of the car. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's the promise I'm making you. Margot leaned across the console and kissed him, pouring into it all the acceptance and choice and terrifying hope she'd been holding back. When she pulled away, his smile was genuine, unguarded in a way she suspected few people ever witnessed. Monday morning, 9 a.m., he reminded her. Welcome to Castellano Enterprises, officially. I'll be there. She walked into her building, nodding to the protective detail that would shadow her for the foreseeable future. Colette was waiting up, studying at the kitchen table as usual. So? Her sister asked without preamble. So I took the job. And maybe something more. Margot couldn't keep the small smile from her face. Colette grinned. About time. You've been making hard eyes at your boss for weeks. I was starting to think you'd never figure it out. When did you become the wise one in this relationship? When you stopped treating me like a kid who needed protection from reality. Colette closed her textbook, suddenly serious. We're going to be okay, right? All of this, the job, him, whatever comes next, we'll handle it? Margot crossed to her sister, pulling her into a tight hug. We'll handle it, together, like we always have. That night, Margot pulled out the Northwestern course catalog one more time. But instead of looking at it with regret for what she'd lost, she saw possibility for what she could still become. A student. Again. A professional in international business. A woman who'd survived impossible circumstances and built something new from the wreckage. And yes, someone involved with a man whose world existed in moral gray areas she was still learning to navigate. Her phone lit up with a final text from Luca. Thank you for choosing to stay. Sleep well. Margot typed back. Thank you for giving me something worth staying for. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, full of dangers and opportunities, legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises existing side by side. Margot had stopped trying to separate them into neat categories. Life was messier than that, more complicated than the simple moral absolutes she'd once believed in. She'd entered Luca's world as a desperate waitress needing money. She was staying as a woman who'd found something unexpected, not just security, but connection. Not just survival, but the possibility of building something real with someone who saw past her circumstances to the person beneath. The future was uncertain. The FBI would keep watching. Rival organizations might make new moves. Luca's past would always be part of their present. But for the first time since her mother died, Margot felt like she was moving forward instead of just treading water. And that was worth the risk. She climbed into bed, listening to Colette's even breathing from the next room, and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. Not perfect. Not uncomplicated. But okay. And sometimes, that was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.